Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman, and today we're going to discuss who gets to define shit code. So this came up out of a conversation where pretty much no one feels like they are delivering shit code, or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But sometimes, that our industry people have strong feelings, tabs versus spaces, and other equally irrelevant feelings. So what happens, or what if my code that I feel is good is your definition of shit?
Hmm.
And I've definitely run into this before. As an example, I was in a Java system, so strongly typed,
Mm-hmm.
and a developer was using an array map as a general instead of an object with strong types. He was throwing everything into a map where you would have key value,
Mm-hmm.
but he never had anywhere where he defined what keys were in there or what you could expect or any of the contract. And
Right.
so what he had was effectively created a loosely typed system inside of his Java code, and I said that was shit. And
Verbatim.
he got very upset.
Did you approach him that strongly?
I did not realize that he was still at the company, and I left it as a comment explaining why it was shit, and why it had to be refactored out,
Yikes.
which he then saw.
That sucks. Okay.
And in my recollection of it, I will stand by the fact that if you do this in Java, where you basically are creating a dynamically typed object no with dynamically typed parameters, and you have nowhere where you say what the parameters that you can expect or should even check or even might know about,
Mm-hmm.
then you are doing a wrong thing. You know, but if you were doing it in Clojure, like that's how Clojure works.
Right.
And so, my years of retrospect later is, oh, well, if this was a functional Java to Clojure type developer, and I think this actually predates Clojure because it's been a while, then he would have been doing it correct, because that's how Clojure works. Is you dynamically, it all works as maps, and it's all dynamic, even though it runs on the JVM.
Okay.
And so there's an example where I strongly felt that he was doing it wrong, and he was strongly offended by me telling him that on accident. Eh. So certainly I can say that telling somebody in a passive aggressive way in a comment is bad, but
Right.
it was still, in my opinion, shit code.
Okay.
But as an example, like, because this is a coding style issue, to further dig in on this specific one, he also had no tests, and there was
Oh,
bugs. So
mm, I feel like one of those things is more objectively bad than subjectively bad. Styling is one thing. No test is like,
right, so tests, right, but how much is sufficient tests? If you come in
right. Yeah, yeah, true.
and you're in a code base and you're like, yeah, we got like a 50% test coverage because we have all these getters and setters. Again, we'll do Java, which is
Mm-hmm.
very verbose. It's a lot of boilerplate.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have any tests on our getters and setters. And so our test coverage is like 50% or 60%. And you're like, that's great code. And somebody else could come in and say, oh, well, your coverage isn't 100%. That's shit.
Yeah, so I guess this is boiling down to a more generic argument of what standards, what happens when two people, let's say they respectively discuss their standards with each other instead of, just jab at the code.
Yes,
um,
don't do that.
when two people respectively disagree on how much standard is good enough to them, like if they prefer better standards up front for a code base, or they prefer more, or they find less than 85% or 90% code coverage to be completely unacceptable and unprofessional.
Hmm.
When you meet, how do you move past that? What if someone says, what we've talked about before about like just moving fast doesn't mean writing shit code, but how do
Right.
you define shit?
That's a great way to say it is. right? Moving fast doesn't require writing shit code. If you truly believe what you're saying, which I do, moving fast requires that you write good code so that you can move fast. And that writing shit code will make you move slow. But how do you define what is good enough for you to move fast? Is a good question.
Right.
And we're in an industry without standard. Well, we have lots of standards, but we don't have standard bodies. I think it's a better way to say it, right? So, like the Bar Association sets standards for lawyers, and
Right.
I don't remember the name, but there's a medical association that sets standards for doctors, right? You have to be so qualified to become a doctor. And we don't have that. And we certainly have, over the years, I've met many people who feel that they are extremely well qualified and have opinions that are extremely strong about standards and how things have to be done that were completely ineffective. I'm trying to say it nicely. They preached standards and philosophy that was not effective at actually delivering software and didn't produce results. So I think it's a very late metric where if you do all of the things, does that deliver code faster? Is the code have fewer bugs? Is it more performant? Is it easier to refactor? And it's a very late metric. It's a very backward looking metric where how would you possibly say, oh, well, we were delivering code at this rate when we were at 50% test coverage, and then we spent 3 months getting the test coverage up to 100%, and now we're delivering code at some other rate, and therefore we can now measure the impact of that extra 50%. Even you can do that. It's hard, but theoretically you can do that, but it's a very backward looking thing where you have to say, oh, well, in this period we had this, and now more time has passed and we have that.
Yeah.
And people don't stay on the job long enough.
That's an interesting point. And as you were talking, you reminded me of a few things, which is basically that short-term versus long-term thinking. A previous conversation we'd had with Rob Ganella on the show earlier. Rob and I have had a lot of conversations about this before, about like what is good architecture and what is good for compromising to deliver earlier. Because sometimes you can look at something and say this thing won't scale, and then you could reply and be like, okay, well, it wasn't intended to. This thing is supposed to be an MVP to see if we actually want to put more money into it. Because if we try to build this thing perfectly, we'd have to have this whole team of all these different engineers and with the correct architecture for everything, assuming it's going to be perfect. And then you get 2 customers and you realize, oh, this is incredibly expensive. This is a failed product, even though it's architecturally perfect. No one will pay for it. And now you've burned, $500,000 or however much you spent on it. So there's that line there of like, good code doesn't have to be perfect code. And you have to have all these other mixtures of that risk in there too. Are we trying to build something that is just a test to see if users want that, or if it's something that's worth this long-term architecture? What does long-term look like? Those are interesting points.
I think where we're going with this is more about intention, right? We're kind of circling to good code is code that does what you intended and doesn't do things that you didn't intend. So if you're writing an MVP, the things that you would want it to do is like whatever minimum functionality you want it to not have bugs. Scalability was not something you wanted. So whether it's scalable or not doesn't come into the quality of the code, right? It's does it work and does it have errors? Possibly because you knew that you were doing an MVP. Is it actually easy to refactor if it's a success?
I think that refactorability is a really good component, because even if it leaves you the ability to iterate towards a more perfect solution. Perfect is a dangerous word in the coding world, but to iterate, if you leave your programs ambiguous and uncertain enough to be able to shift once you realize that you need to shift, or the thing you were solving for was not quite what you thought it was, or customers didn't use it quite like you thought it was, you leave yourself a lot more room than if you try to be the 100% test coverage guy who locks down everything, and then suddenly you want to change functionality and you have to change 300 tests because
I've
you
been
had
there.
such brittle, uh, your functionality was so locked in that you spent most of your time writing tests on something that actually wasn't proven to be a useful function or a useful product.
Right. Um, I just lost my train of thought. The the whole because I think there are times where you don't actually want something to change, right? I've
Mm-hmm.
written over the years plenty of shims or conversion tools.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, we had this data set up in the database like this, and we're going to move all the data to new columns in a new storage like that. One example I can think of is we had custom fields, and it was just a giant table of field and then the field ID value, and they were all
Mm-hmm.
stored as strings, and then you would have to cast them to something. And we wanted to split that into custom fields that are strings, custom fields that are ints, custom fields that
Yeah.
are whatever, doubles. And so I wrote a tool to go through the database and put the data in the right places. And I don't remember, now that I'm saying it out loud, I don't remember why this had to be a tool and not SQL. But in that case, like I intended to write it and I intended to run it. And once it was done, I didn't ever intend to refactor it. And so
Mm.
refactorability was not something that I needed for that tool to be quality. I needed it to not ever make a mistake.
Yeah.
And I needed it to be performant enough. But I didn't. Once I had it, I didn't ever intend to refactor it because I never expected
Be a
to run it
one-time
again.
use kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Once you're done with it, you're throw it away.
and that's a different case, right, than an
Right.
MVP where I expect I'm going to refactor it
Mm-hmm.
or throw it away. But I don't expect that performance is especially important for the MVP.
Another good call out there too. Yeah, it always comes back to it depends, right? There's
It
so many
depends,
factors.
right? What is
Yeah.
good code and what is shit code? It
Well, I guess that's
depends.
kind of what I'm getting at. Only a Sith speaks in absolutes, right? uh, the idea that if you start skewing away from the concept of it depends to where you're like, I know this is supposed to be the standard all the time, and my way is right.
Mm,
I think that's when you start leaning towards the wrong side of the argument. I think that a degree of uncertainty and flexibility is what makes like you need to be able to adapt and evolve to changing circumstances.
yeah,
And to me, that is good code.
that's very good. So it depends what good code is, and absolutes are going to lead you in the wrong direction. Right? Like,
Yes. To phrase it, if the only law in the programming world is that there is uncertainty and that it depends on the situation, then
mhm,
having a law in general outside that one makes no sense.
right. Unless it's tabs versus spaces, in which case it's always
Don't do
whichever. I,
this.
I don't care.
Okay. I'm like,
Like I don't
no,
care. But like
don't
there are
live.
people I've met many
Yeah.
people
Mm.
who absolutely cared.
Yeah.
Mostly spaces, thinking about it. But like I don't care. I'm not even sure it depends. Mostly I just don't care.
Yeah.
But there
I
are
don't
people
care.
who are like absolutely we have
Yeah.
to go back and run a script and that will convert all the tabs to spaces and then recommit everything to the repository.
This reminds me of past me, like the annoying English nerd in high school, who's like the "you mean for whom" person, and everyone's like, "Oh my god, this guy,"
The
which I'm technically correct, but it
best
doesn't
kind of
matter
correct.
because English is an it depends language. It shapes, it changes. Even the incorrect things can become correct. It's an open source language with pull requests against it all the time.
Yes.
And so I was very
Well,
much a
more
stickler.
American English than
Sure. Yeah.
British English. They have some
Anyway,
standards.
language is it should be fluid. It's how people use it that matters to me.
Well,
And if
French
your
is
message
very
is,
not that way. They are
mm,
very strict and they push hard against loan words creeping in.
oh yeah, that means it's a lack of adaptability in the coding
Yes,
world.
which is why French has gone from one of the standard languages to that thing that people speak in France.
Oof. That's an interesting other topic. But anyway,
Yes.
I think we've exhausted this one.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.